Welcome back to the podcast. My name's Alex, I'm a consultant psychiatrist. Today I want to take some time to talk about the 1999 Sam Mendes film American Beauty. I recently rewatched it after about 10 years, and I was struck by how with an ensemble cast and a concise, well-written plot, the film has a lot to teach us about ourselves, human nature, the traps we fall into, how this can potentially be avoided, and the things in life which matter the most. The film stars Kevin Spacey, who, during a recent interview on the Lex Friedman podcast, discussed how of all the films and TV work he's done over the years, the one which people seem most impacted by is American Beauty, and when rewatching it myself, I can see why that could be the case. It's hard to watch this film without asking yourself some hard questions about the way you are living your life, to what extent you are prioritizing the wrong things, to what extent you're denying important aspects of yourself. I'm aware that obviously Kevin Spacey himself has been embroiled in a lot of controversy over the past few years, but rather than getting stuck in that, I'd like to just discuss the film itself, which of course is a product of many people's work, including Kevin Spacey, Sam Mendes, the rest of the cast, and many others. Released in 1999, American Beauty tackles a lot of existential themes, like a lot of movies released around this time, like Fight Club and Magnolia, and some films and shows that were to come later, like Breaking Bad. I'd like to talk about what the film can teach us psychologically, but first I'll break down the plot, and of course if you haven't seen this film, spoilers will be forthcoming. American Beauty opens with Lester Burnham narrating from beyond the grave, telling the audience that he will die in less than a year. Lester is a 42-year-old advertising executive who lives in a suburban neighborhood with his wife, Carolyn, a real estate agent, and their teenage daughter, Jane. Despite their outward appearance of success, the Burnham family is deeply unhappy. They live in a luxurious home, although it's strongly suggested that Carolyn earns the bulk of the income for the family. Lester himself is trapped in a midlife crisis. He feels detached from his monotonous job, his marriage is loveless. Carolyn, obsessed with her image and success, has a cold and controlling nature. Jane is a typical angsty teenager. She's a little self-conscious, she's a little insecure, she's struggling with her identity. The turning point for Lester comes when he meets Angela, Jane's attractive, confident best friend. Angela's flirtatious behavior seems to awaken Lester's dormant sexuality and everything that comes with that, and it prompts him to radically change his life. He quits his job by blackmailing his boss for a lucrative severance package. He begins working as an entry-level server at a fast food restaurant, which is a job he finds oddly satisfying. He begins exercising, smoking weed. He buys a vintage car, all in an effort seemingly to recapture his lost youth. Meanwhile, Carolyn starts an affair with Buddy, her successful real estate rival. Her pursuit of perfection and success leads her to moral and ethical compromises. And of course the affair puts further strain on her relationship with Lester. Jane, on the other hand, begins a relationship with their new neighbor Ricky Fitz, an introspective and artistic teenager who films everything around him. Ricky lives with his authoritarian father, Colonel Frank Fitz, and his mother, who appears largely detached from life. Ricky and Jane bond over their shared sense of alienation and their family difficulties and their desire to escape their suffocating environments. As the film progresses, all these relationships develop and intertwine. It's revealed that Ricky makes money by selling weed, and Ricky starts selling weed to Lester. Colonel Fitz, because of Ricky's absences and spending time with Lester, begins to suspect that they're engaging in a homosexual relationship. And then we start to understand that Colonel Fitz is in fact struggling with his own repressed homosexuality, and he makes a sexual advance on Lester, mistakenly believing him to be gay, only to be rejected. As the film moves towards its tragic flashpoint, all the storylines converge. Lester catches Carolyn in her affair with Buddy, and Carolyn, distraught over this and the prospect of her failing marriage, returns home with a gun, contemplating killing Lester. Angela acts increasingly flirtatiously with Lester, and in a moment of vulnerability she admits all her fears to Lester, that in fact Despite her confident facade and her constant talk of all her sexual exploits, she's revealed to be insecure and vulnerable, and she eventually confesses to Lester that she's actually a virgin. Lester comforts Angela and decides not to pursue a sexual relationship with her. Interestingly, in this moment, he finally finds a certain sense of peace and contentment. He realizes that he can appreciate the beauty in the simplest moments of his life as he reflects on happier times with his wife and daughter. This serenity is short-lived, however, because Colonel Fitz, humiliated and enraged by his earlier encounter with Lester, sneaks into the Burnham household and shoots Lester, killing him. The film ends with Lester's death, and his final monologue reflects on the fleeting nature of life and the beauty in everyday moments. So what can we learn from this film? I think the main thing we learn from this film is how common it is for people to deny the growth of their personality. And by personality, I mean some very specific things. I mean the way you relate to yourself, other people, the world, the work you do, the things you do every day. As people go through their life, their personality is supposed to grow and mature. Their view on life is supposed to change. Things that were satisfying once eventually cease to be satisfying, and we are supposed to form new goals and visions for our lives. We're supposed to continue developing ourselves. The psychiatrist Carl Jung called this process individuation. Jung described individuation as a central process of human development, where a person becomes a unique individual, distinct from the collective consciousness of society. This process involves integrating various aspects of the self, including the conscious and unconscious mind, to achieve a balanced and whole personality. Individuation is not just about becoming different from others, but realizing one's true potential and authentic self, integrating all the aspects of one's psychology into a relatively harmonious whole. And the process of individuation is not just some abstract internal thing. The extent to which we have individuated and cultivated our sense of self is reflected in our external lives, in the quality of our relationships, our ability to handle difficult situations, to deal with success, failure, and even tragedy. It's reflected in our ability to appreciate beauty in our work and the fulfillment we get from it, and the overall satisfaction we get from our lives. For many people, and for many different reasons, this process of individuation stops at some point. The main reason for this, I suspect, is that because self-development and personality growth are not things which are explicitly discussed as goals to strive for in mainstream society, especially after school or university, and there are many things like reliance on technology, social isolation, hedonistic pursuits, drugs and alcohol, the prioritization of wealth, which subvert and interrupt natural personality development. Getting back to American Beauty, we see people in many different, difficult predicaments. Although the way their problems are manifesting is quite different in each case, there is one common through line between the different dysfunctional characters. They have all denied different aspects of themselves, and the growth of their personality has been stunted. To deal with this, they each have different personas they use to cope with and shield themselves from the world. First, let's look at Lester. Lester is the protagonist. He's a 42-year-old advertising executive. He is depicted as being disenchanted with his job. He feels trapped in his monotonous routine. At the beginning of the story, the greatest pleasure of his day is masturbating in the shower. Lester's persona is that of a dry, cynical misanthrope, someone who feels jaded by life. He speaks mostly in superficially friendly tones, but he also gets his pleasure by sly, sarcastic remarks which allow him to feel temporarily better than the people around him. His wife and daughter, meanwhile, treat him with open disrespect. The reflection of his image in his computer monitor at work shows him to be in a kind of prison, with the sign on his desk begging us to look closer. When Lester is speaking to his boss, being asked essentially to reapply for his own job, Mendes uses wide shots to suggest his powerlessness and insignificance in comparison to his boss, who we see from below, taking up most of the frame. Back at home with his family, the long dinner table he eats at with his wife illustrates the physical and emotional distance between them. The atmosphere in the home is sterile and unemotional. When he goes to his daughter's high school event, he is easily fooled by the seductive persona of Angela, which we'll look at later, which reduces him to a kind of adolescent impotence. Inappropriate as this may be, it's Angela's sexuality which wakes Lester out of his midlife slumber. He begins to say what he thinks, act out, starts to exercise, he blackmails his boss. A lot of his behaviors at a glance are highly dysfunctional, but we as the audience can't help but share in the exhilaration of watching someone actually engage with life. And of course, we also see how his actions catalyze change in the other characters and accelerate the plot towards its tragic end. Next we have Carolyn, Lester's wife. Carolyn appears entirely different to Lester. On the surface, she is calm, pleasant, and well put together. She cooks sophisticated meals for her family in their well-decorated home. She listens to upbeat, easy-listening jazz music. But in private moments at the beginning of the film, while, for example, she is preparing a home to show to some potential buyers, we see how fragile her personality really is. She's easily moved to tears and fits of rage when things don't go her way. Psychologically, her house is built on shaky foundations, and she relies on self-help tapes and affirmations to keep her going. When Lester begins to change, you can see that Carolyn is outraged that the static dynamic of their marriage is changing, and yet, beneath the outrage, you can also see a kind of relief that things are finally changing. She is more respectful of Lester and even more attracted to him, more in awe of him, as though she had no idea what he was capable of. It's interesting to see how as Lester and Carolyn begin to rediscover themselves, the sexual chemistry between them reignites, and in fact, towards the middle of the film, they almost have sex again for the first time in a long time. However, the moment is ruined when they collapse back into an old pattern of arguing about cleanliness. It's clear that by this point their marriage is overburdened by long-standing disagreements and resentments, which have never really been ironed out. Carolyn is seduced, however, by Buddy Kane, and of course she would be. He represents everything she aspires to, and they share a desire to portray an image of success and perfection at all costs. It's unclear to what extent Carolyn's affair with Buddy was made possible by Lester's acting out, or whether she would have done it regardless. But when she is in fact caught by Lester in the affair, and faced with the likely failure of her marriage, she contemplates the nuclear option, the choice of murdering Lester herself, before that choice is ultimately taken away from her by Colonel Fitz. Once Carolyn finds Lester murdered, she immediately realizes how much he means to her, despite everything, and she goes to his wardrobe and hugs his old clothes. Next, let's look at Angela, the character who inadvertently sets the events of the film in motion. Angela is Jane's best friend in high school, and despite being just a teenager, she herself has a pronounced narcissistic persona. She consistently idealizes herself and devalues others. She speaks about people based mostly on their perceived social status and value, and she reveals to Jane that her deepest fear is being ordinary, which is typical of narcissism. For Angela, sexual appeal and validation from others is her primary means of feeling okay within herself. She has not yet developed the ability to self-validate and accept the ordinariness of her existence, and this prompts her to act in a persistently flirtatious manner towards Lester. She brags confidently to Jane about her sexual exploits for the whole film, and puts Jane down for her lack of sexual experience, only to reveal at the end of the film that her sexual exploits have been entirely fabricated. The change in dynamic between Lester and Angela is perhaps the most compelling in the whole film. At the beginning, we see an immature, dweebish man with a seemingly confident girl. What we are actually seeing is a man with an underdeveloped personality, fooled by a girl with a narcissistic persona which she wears like a suit of armor. After Lester develops his personality and gains some self-confidence, he interacts with Angela differently, and she can be more authentic herself. She reveals herself to be the shy, frightened girl that she actually is. This, in turn, shatters the seductive spell for Lester, and their dynamic ceases to be one of a sexual nature, and instantly becomes the more appropriate dynamic of a grown man and a teenage girl, almost more of a father-daughter dynamic. This transforms what was almost an act of sexual assault to a moment of compassion and kindness. The fourth character we have to look at is Colonel Fitz. We know little about Colonel Fitz, other than he's a military man who exerts a lot of authoritarian control over his family. He is so identified with his military persona that he unironically identifies himself as Colonel Fitz, United States Marine Corps, when meeting his new neighbors. We see, of course, that he is largely driven in his behavior by his repressed homosexuality. Initially, this is exemplified by homophobic remarks he makes to his son while driving him to school. Later, we see he is terrified of the possibility of his son being gay, physically fighting him and kicking him out of the house when he suspects that he is. And even later, we find out that this part of him is so vulnerable that when he makes an advance to Lester and is rejected, he is driven to murder him outright. Colonel Fitz is a sad and tragic character. He exemplifies the extremes people can go to when they find one part of themselves so unacceptable that they need to construct a whole life defending against it. This is a defense mechanism Freud would have called reaction formation. Fitz is a reminder that to those with certain dispositions, extreme shame can quickly transform into resentment and rage, which at its worst can be homicidal. Colonel Fitz's wife Barbara is also worth mentioning. We don't see Barbara much in the film, but when she's on screen it's easy to miss her because she is blank-faced with a flat affect. She's clearly the most repressed person in the film and is unable to express herself at all. We see from her interactions with others that she is barely even aware of her surroundings. Clinically, she is reminiscent of someone with severe depression. It's unclear whether she became this way as a result of living under the tyranny of Colonel Fitz, or whether this is the result of some previous trauma, or some combination of both. But Barbara exemplifies the extreme state of shutdown a person can reach when they've experienced far too much for too long. Funnily enough, the two teenagers, Jane and Ricky, appear to be the least dysfunctional characters, although in many respects they're very different from each other. Jane comes across as a typical teenager. She tries, in the midst of all the chaos of the film, to figure out her identity. Despite being just a teenager, she's able to clearly see and describe the dysfunction around her, and point this out to both of her parents and to Angela throughout the film. She feels alienated by both of her parents and understandably perturbed that her best friend would make sexual advances towards her father, but she's able to form a meaningful relationship with Ricky. Ricky has experienced a significant amount of psychological trauma. He was institutionalized at a young age by his father for getting into a fight at school, and yet has come out of the other side of all that, not entirely free of eccentricities, but confident, fiercely independent, resourceful, and apparently having had some form of spiritual awakening, because he is able to appreciate the smaller serendipitous moments in life which pass most people by. He appears as a character that can self-validate, that can do things for intrinsic, self-motivated reasons rather than for extrinsic reasons. He is so moved with the beauty of life that he videotapes everything for fear of missing anything. His confidence allows him to pursue and start a relationship with Jane, and unlike Lester, he is not fooled by Angela's narcissistic facade. He is easily able to see through her and appreciate Jane's more robust, down-to-earth character. Ricky is perhaps the best example of what a person can aspire to in the film. Someone who has gone through life's traumas, but who has not been beaten into retreat from life like his mother, or into a resentful cynicism like his father, but someone who has etched their way towards a certain kind of wisdom. It's not obvious for what reason most of the characters are denying such important aspects of their personality. Mendes leaves us to imagine what most of the characters' backstories are, yet this does not leave the audience wanting, because the characters feel so true to life. Like many people we run into every day whose pasts we don't know, yet we can easily speculate what may have happened to them to lead them into their current predicaments. The film takes place in a tyrannically suburban sprawl, in large, expensive houses, mostly lacking in unique expression or character. Many conversations in the film allude to the fragility of this luxurious life, and the financial stress this can put people under. And remember, this was 1999, not long before the financial crisis of 2008. Lester after his transformation, and Ricky are the two characters that express themselves the most confidently throughout the film, and both, through illicit means, Lester by using blackmail and Ricky by selling drugs, have access to large amounts of disposable cash. This strongly suggests that in a capitalist system, having easy access to large amounts of money can unburden someone of the need to distort one's personality in order to fit in. This is contrasted with Carolyn and Buddy Kane, who both work extremely hard selling real estate, and they portray the psychological cost of earning a living by constantly having to sustain an image of normality and perfection. So to conclude, it feels rare for me nowadays for a film like American Beauty to kind of punch you in the face with insight like this. It's easy to criticize the film for being typical of its time, but I think it has a lot of timeless psychological lessons. The film highlights the different ways people deny their personalities, whether it's through aggression, control, repression, narcissism, or a frank withdrawal from life. It's important to point out the characters as displayed in the film don't end up this way overnight. They end up this way gradually by making the daily conscious or unconscious decision to deny their desires, to not cultivate their values, or not examine their life over years and years. The explosive events of this film take place rapidly, but after years of built-up psychological tension in each of the characters which has never been addressed. American Beauty is a cautionary tale. It warns us not to deny ourselves, that our psychology has a momentum all of its own, that if not attended to, our desires can become resentments, and resentments unaddressed can cause us to act out with all sorts of dysfunctional behavior, ranging from quitting your job to murder. If you can, it's important to become conscious about what you care about, and make ongoing attempts to actualize your values in your life. If you do not, you will tend to default to the values of your culture. For example, a lot of the characters in American Beauty default to the trappings of conforming to a capitalist, Western, secular culture. Many aspects of living in such a culture are fine, of course, but by themselves they are unlikely to nourish one's spirit and incentivize one to keep growing across life. The film has a few things to say about long-term relationships as well. It reveals how a successful long-term marriage requires the tension between two successful, thriving personalities, rather than merely the dynamic of a controlling tyrant and a submissive slave, as exemplified by both Lester and Carolyn, and more severely by Colonel Fitz and Barbara. It shows us that marriage is about so much more than power, and that by engaging in power games, you are almost certainly dooming your marriage or relationship to unhappiness or outright failure. Lastly, the film demonstrates that there's a certain contagiousness to one's psychological state. If you remain constricted within a persona, you subtly encourage others to do the same, while when one person wakes up out of a daze, it can prompt others to do the same. Although it's fair warning to say that, as in this film, this can often be an unpleasant and conflict-laden process. Thanks for listening. If you've watched this film recently, I hope you found this thought-provoking, and if you haven't, I hope this provokes you to watch and see what you think for yourself. This is the Thinking Mind Podcast, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychology, psychotherapy, and related topics. If you like it, do share with a friend, give us a rating. Following or subscribing on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen is the best thing you can do to help us grow. And in addition, if psychotherapy is something you're interested in yourself, I'm now offering one-on-one psychotherapy sessions, both online or in person in the South London area. So if that's something you're interested in, you can email me at alexcurmitherapy@gmail.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you here next time.